Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. In this week's show, we're going to cover three things. First is the banning of the entrance of the blogger Alexander Lapshin into Armenia. Then we're going to move on to give you an update about the parliamentary election campaigns and say a few words about the 111th anniversary of the first Armenian Genocide. Last week, the noted Israeli blogger Alexander Lapshin was denied entry into Armenia. For those of you who do not know who he is, he was the gentleman who was actually kidnapped and tortured by the Baku regime for the crime of visiting Artsakh about a decade ago. According to Mr. Lapshin, he was denied entry into the country, where he has lived for many years, by the National Security Service because of his podcast interview with Gevorg Sujan, who's one of the 4 hostages who were traded for the 2 Syrian mercenaries a few months back. Because during that podcast, Mr. Gevorg Sujan had discussed how he was tortured while he was being held as a hostage by the Baku regime. We can only guess that these revelations contradicts the government's primary narrative that our neighbor is actually a misunderstood Austria. In and of itself, this is disturbing. What I fear, however, this might be actually a glimpse into the future, specifically the post-election future, in which the government will use the issue of peace and its peace agenda to essentially start oppressing or imprisoning anyone who opposes the Finlandization of Armenia by the Baku regime. Imagine the creation of an inverted totalitarian system built on peace, tolerance, and heart and septic signs. Police last week arrested more than a dozen individuals affiliated with the Strong Armenia Alliance on charges of distributing bribes to voters in the town of Artashat in the run-up to the country's June parliamentary election. The party, led by Russian Armenian businessman Samvel Karapetyan, is seen as the main challenger to Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's civil contract party in the election that will decide the country's next prime minister. This all could be one of 3 things. The first one is a sincere attempt to fight electoral fraud. And the second one is a politically motivated attack on your primary opponent. Or the third, which is the first step in using what are real charges to actually outlaw Mr. Karapetyan's party, which I suspect is the real case. There's very clear rhetoric coming from this government, from the Prime Minister himself, that leads towards banning of the party. And a few days ago, he actually accused, in so many words, Mr. Karapetyan of being a foreign operative. He's obviously referring to Russia. And I suspect that this banning will likely occur after the EU-Armenia summit in early May. This government actually has real and rational reasons for wanting to ban Mr. Karapetyan's party for their own interests. The end of Mr. Karapetyan's party, if they're banned, would automatically mean that Robert Kocharyan's party, his alliance, will actually pass the 8% threshold and make it into the parliament. And because currently, as it stands, Mr. Karapetyan eats a lot of the Kocharyan votes and would likely prevent Kocharyan's return back into the parliament. For the purposes of this government, Kocharyan is to them what air is to fire. They cannot exist without the fear of Mr. Kocharyan coming back, and him being in the parliament for the next 5 years will be quite useful. At the same time, if there's going to be a second round, Mr. Karapetyan is a far more dangerous opponent in the second round than Robert Kocharyan will ever be, because he actually has no chance of winning. And in a second round scenario, there's a very good chance that all the other parties will actually coalesce behind Mr. Karapetyan just to get rid of Nikol Pashinyan. Mr. Karapetyan is actually, obviously being a billionaire, has tremendous resources. He also has actually in polling very low negatives, unlike Robert Kocharyan, whose negatives are off the chart. So even in opposition, if he's allowed to stay in, he will actually be quite a dangerous opponent because of the resources that were available to him. Now, what would all of this mean to our electoral process if Mr. Karapetyan's party is banned? It would actually greatly diminish the credibility of our democratic process. Part of the result could be that it could very well bring in pro-Western forces into the parliament, whether it's Mr. Tatoyan and Haik Marutyan's party, because that 20 or 25% that will no longer go to Mr. Karapetyan will actually be spread in many different directions, and not all of it will go to Kocharyan. The ruling party will take the heat for this, but the political payoff is worth it. And one of the primary reasons that I suspect that this action will be entirely supported by the EU and their officialdom here, and they actually have a track record of banning parties, the most recent one being in Romania. So none of this would be unusual for them. Now we'll say a few words about the 111th anniversary of the start of the first Armenian genocide, and what we're going to discuss is sort of the way this government has used this issue for its purposes over the last year and a half. And one of the things to look at is, it's long been a trope both in Baku and Ankara that it is the diaspora that is only obsessed with this genocide issue. And once you get the diaspora out of the picture, and the local Armenians who live in Armenia will be a lot more amenable and will easily bend at the knee for everything that the regime in Baku and Ankara demands, as if people living here have no agency. Let's look at the ways that this government has tried to weaponize this issue to push forward its political agenda.
Մենք հայոց ցեղասպանության պատմությանն էլ պետք է վերադառնանք, պետք է հասկանանք լավ ինչ է տեղի ունեցել եւ ինչու է տեղի ունեցել։ Եվ ինչպես ենք մենք դա ընկալել, ում միջոցով ենք ընկալել։ Ոնց է որ 1939 թվին հայոց ցեղասպանության օրակարգ չի եղել եւ ոնց է որ 1950 թվին հայոց ցեղասպանության օրակարգ հայտնվել է։ Ոնց է եղել, ես մենք պետք է հասկանանք, թե չպետք է հասկանանք։ Այս թեմաների հետ պետք է հարաբերվենք, թե չպետք է հարաբերվենք։
The Prime Minister has absolutely nothing to gain by raising these issues, frankly, because there's no constituencies in Armenia demanding or questioning any of the things that he's questioning. Some of this actually leaves even his supporters scratching their heads. Yet he constantly raises this genocide issue, the most recent one being the firing of the genocide museum director for handing a book to J.D. Vance that he didn't approve of. So we have to ask ourselves, why is someone who's actually so politically attuned would pick an issue and concentrate on it that is a complete loser? And the only logical explanation is that he's actually virtue signaling to Ankara and Baku that he's actually willing to pick a fight with the Armenian diaspora on an issue that they think the diaspora cares about. The truth is that there actually are differences between the Armenia and diaspora on many issues because they essentially come from completely different experiences. However, those differences are frankly not that great when it comes to Armenia's national security or our collective history. Now, what is foolish about all of this is if the Prime Minister is actually interested in state building, which I believe he actually is sincere about, you cannot accelerate that process without full engagement with the Armenian diaspora. I have been very critical of many diaspora institutions for their failures, and specifically certain Armenian organizations are way too obsessed with this genocide issue rather than state building in Armenia. And on this issue, the Prime Minister is not incorrect. However, you can actually make that point without declaring war on our history or on our diaspora. Let's understand what the diaspora has meant for Armenia for the past 35 years. There's no diaspora, there's no TUMO, there's no IT business, which so much of it is based on diaspora relationships. There's no co-op, which I know the Prime Minister loves. There's no defense sector, which is being all set up mostly by diasporans. There's no data center that everyone's raving about. There's no Kafeshtyan, Kaskad complex, and many other touristic landmarks in Yerevan. There's no relationship with France, which has been so useful to this country without the work of the French Armenian diaspora. Imagine an Armenia without all of these things that I just outlined. What is most ridiculous, that at this point in which every major country in the world like China and India are actually trying to create a global nation, our own government is trying to limit us to a very small geographic area without engaging the full Armenian nation for state building purposes. And all of this to virtue signal to our enemies whose problems with us are not political, but existential. Thank you for joining me this week's episode of Insights.
Zavat yer cani, anu şayreni, kın ku şayreni.